So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Tara McPherson is based at the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, where she is the HMH Foundation Endowed Chair for the Study of Censorship in Media, also the director of the Sidney Harman Academy for Polymathic Study, and the faculty chair of USC's Visions and Voices initiative. So just from those titles alone, you can get a sense of the level and focus of her work. Her scholarship engages the cultural dimensions of digital media and focuses on digital humanities, early software histories, gender and race, as well as the development of new tools and paradigms for digital publishing. Her current book project investigates the use of online platforms in the spread of hate and white supremacy. Her most recently published book is Feminist in a Software Lab, published by Harvard University Press in 2018. It was awarded the 2018 Garfinkel Prize in Digital Humanities, and I think we're going to hear some insights from that book today. Professor McPherson was also the founding editor of the pioneering multimedia journal Vectors and lead PI of the open source digital publishing platform Scalar, both of which you'll also hear about today. I encourage you all to check out her work, which you can find more about on her website. We will have some time for questions and discussion after the talk. So please do put your questions into the Q&A box, and you can do that at any time during the talk, and we'll get to them at the end. Tara, we're super pleased that you can join us today. Thank you. I'll turn the screen over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm very grateful to you and your colleagues for having me here. I know a lot of work goes into conceptualizing series like this and putting all the parts together. And I'm grateful to be here if in virtual space, right? I'm going to talk a little bit, as Brian hinted today, about the kind of trajectory of work I've done around digital media, both in what we might call forms of storytelling and also new forms of scholarship. And I'm going to start that by taking you pretty far back in time to the early 1990s when I was a graduate student, partially by way of explaining how I got to doing this, which was not a kind of expected outcome, I think, given my training. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to navigate around the extra things Zoom has put on it. And then we're going to go to here. Okay. So as Brian mentioned, I'm a professor in a film school, and I was trained to be a feminist film scholar. So the work I learned to do primarily as a grad student was to analyze films and to think about how they related to gender and to race and to how we made sense of the world around us. So thinking about visual storytelling in fairly deep ways. But while I was in that program, I had the opportunity to also take a series of classes that involved the making of film, particularly video, and often in team talk courses between a film scholar and a filmmaker. And a really transformative class for me was a class in feminist filmmaking. And that class showed me the deep interrelations between the way a humanities scholar might study film and the way that feminist filmmakers in the 70s and 80s were very much in dialogue with scholars. So there wasn't a divide between the making of film and the thinking about film. And that experience really stayed with me. It shaped the filmmakers I studied, and it shaped the scholars that I read. So by the late 70s, early 80s, before I had gone to college or started grad school, scholars were already, like Claire Johnston, really thinking about what was gained by thinking about theoretical work or analytical work alongside practical work. And they understood at the time that it was very important that feminists not only study film, but also try to make films differently, to make different kinds of films that offer new opportunities for women characters, but also for women behind the camera. And they saw that work as deeply related. And they understood that doing that work not only changed representation, but it also changed how we could think about distribution, how we might think about access, how we would think about media networks, right? And I know we don't typically now think of film as a network, but it was very much a networked practice. And feminist film makers had to build their own environments to be able to screen their work and share their work. So in studying this material as a graduate student, I think it planted a seed for me to try to always hold theory and practice in productive tension, to think about how they might relate to each other in fundamental ways. And that has continued to shape how I think about digital publishing and how I think about my teaching. So I teach, as I said, in a film school, and one of the things we have in our environment is a doctoral program that very much blends theory and practice. So in that program, our graduate students undertake work, usually in digital media, that encompasses digital storytelling, but that could also kind of push the boundaries of how we theorize media in relation to making media. So this project is by a PhD student, Sarah Siston. It's called Lady Mouth. It was an early performative bot that was, out on the internet, tweeting bits of feminist knowledge into the spaces it inhabited. So it would come across misogynist language on Twitter and tweet perhaps a bit of Audre Lorde, back into the space. And it was very interesting as a kind of performance, but it was also interesting, long before today's AI tools, to see whether or not people, or how long it took someone to discern that they were talking to a bot. Catherine Griffiths finished in the program a few years ago. She's now a professor at University of Michigan. She's trying to help scientists understand actually what algorithms do as they try, as they in AI sort of escape the knowledge even of their creators. And that's partially done by thinking of new ways to visualize the activity of algorithms. Triton Mobley is now a professor on the East Coast. Triton is interested in projects that help us understand how technology does or does not account for Blackness, and has done a variety of projects in that theme. Samantha Gorman is now a professor at Northeastern in Boston. She also runs a well-established digital production studio called Tender Claws that has made a number of very successful video games for clients like Google. So you could find her online quite easily. So all of those students are engaged in that same mix of theory and practice that I found so energizing and transformative when I was a grad student myself. And I'm constantly amazed by the kind of work they're able to do to really hold humanistic and ethical questions together with production and design. And that kind of impetus has driven my work for 20 years and led me to really form collaborative spaces where folks could work together to do different kinds of work. An early experiment in that regard was the journal that Brian mentioned, Vectors. Vectors began in early 2000s, before you had an iPhone or an iPad or even much video online, right, is a way to begin to experiment with screen-based language and to figure out what new kinds of things we might be able to do with the digital and how those vernaculars that came from the popular might also infuse the scholarly. Like, how might we do scholarship differently? What would it mean to have the thing you were analyzing, like a film clip, available in the publication itself as an online format? So as we started working on this, and this was a team of 2 editors, Steve Anderson and I, Eric Lawyer and Reagan Kelly, who were creative directors, and our technical lead, Craig Dietrich. And we published things that could not exist in print. We created a process where we worked with scholars, and a designer, a technologist, and an editor worked with a scholar over 5 to 6 months to publish projects that really didn't look like conventional scholarly projects. And some of them were like this piece, which is by the artist and scholar Sharon Daniel. It's called Public Secrets, and it's an audio documentary of about 60 hours of testimony from women incarcerated at the largest women's prison, which is in Northern California, Chowchilla. And in her work with the group Justice Now, Sharon recorded women's own interpretations of their location within a prison and what that meant and how it reflected on society as a whole. And the piece unfolds a lot like a video game as you start to make choices of what to interact with, what you hear. Other pathways in the project become open to you. Now, it's not a game you're going to fight or win in, but it has a logic of unfolding that is partially learned from the choice-based logic in early video games. And in a project like this, Sharon was very interested in how the experience of the piece might lead people to think differently about how we incarcerate people and what a vision of abolishing a prison system might look like. And her piece was immediately taken up by the activist group to use in their work, but it also screened in galleries and was used in classrooms. It won a Webby Award. So it had a kind of reach and accessibility that many scholarly projects don't have. It was aimed at different publics. This project by Karen Kaplan called Dead Reckoning looked at how military vision from early in the 18th century created certain views that enabled perspectives in wartime. And she's gone on to write this project as a hard copy scholarly book, but this digital project was a very early iteration of thinking through the ideas that would appear in her book. This piece is a collection of soldier shot video during the war in Iraq after 9/11. And these pieces circulated on early video channels pre-YouTube and were collected by Jenny and archived in this project in this triptych form, where as you finish one video, another loads into the piece. And what Jenny's interested in the piece is to really help us rethink masculinity in wartime as it's reflected in this soldier captured video. And it also helps us think about how wars in the 21st century really adopted logics not dissimilar to video games in the soldier mounted headset, which provide a first person point of view into what was happening. This piece is more historical by Emily Thompson, a historian at Princeton, and it maps sound files from the very early 20th century over the landscape of Manhattan alongside letters of complaint that citizens wrote to the city about how noisy New York was becoming. A problem I think New York still hasn't solved, right? But this piece is a good example of how an archive and an argument came together digitally. You could explore through space, you could explore through time, you could read Emily's essay, and you could kind of move between archive and analysis. Finally, last vectors piece I want to mention is this piece, Digital Dynamics Across Culture, which we did with a brand new PhD student out of Santa Cruz in anthropology, who used her field work, a lot of field recordings of audio and video, to help us think about how differently Aboriginal people understood property relations, social relations, and spatiality. So the piece uses that different understanding of space, time, and ownership to suggest that perhaps the way Western technologies and archives have approached the appropriation of knowledge from Indigenous peoples is invasive, right? And the piece resists that in its design and in how you navigate through it. She's gone on since that time to build Makutu, which is a really robust archiving and content management system for Indigenous communities to be able to set permissions to their materials in ways that respect their knowledge protocols. So she's been enormously successful at thinking about how you might design technologies differently, a concern that's really been at the heart of our lab as well. Now, if you try to go to vectors now while you're listening to me, you'll very quickly learn that the journal ended after, several years run. And you'll also find as you start to click through projects that many of the projects you can't see anymore, right? They were built through our design, with our design team, through a platform called Flash by Adobe, which is still a fantastic program for interaction design, but not if you wanted to play on any devices Steve Jobs helped create, because Apple sort of unilaterally decided it would not support Flash projects. And that decision meant that gradually browsers also chose not to support Flash projects, which indicates how complex your choices are in making digital projects. Books are probably going to last a lot longer than most digital projects, but the experiential elements of the digital are still, for me, very compelling. We also learned a lot of other things from vectors. We learned that their experimental design, particularly in the context of, the mid-aughts around 2006, demanded a great deal from the user. They were, each piece had its own unique design. They were really elaborate one-offs made for that specific project, almost like being in an art gallery, right? So users were not sure if they had finished them, right? Users weren't used to interacting with visual media online yet. I think if we were to do vectors now, it would not feel so experimental or odd, because you've spent so much time with your iPad swiping, moving, zooming, pinching, right? All kind of tactile techniques for moving through art and information that we experimented with at Vectors, but that we're a little bit ahead of their time, I think, right? So many of the projects now are not available on our original site, but they are being archived as, what you hope will happen to, lost projects from the early days might be, through the Electronic Literature Organization and their next initiative. So many of the projects are now available, at least as video walkthroughs, to give you a sense of how their interactivity unfolded, what they felt and looked like. And we're hoping more and more of the projects will come aboard this way until we find, an easy, good Flash emulator, right? So there are also, besides the preservation project problems and the interpretation problems, it's also still very hard to properly ethically design interactive projects for people who don't have good sight or hearing, or who may be limited in tactile movement, right? So this is a pressure point and ongoing issue for many scholarly projects. Based on what we learned at Vectors, we decided we would work on an authoring platform that would be robust and flexible and let other people begin to build their own projects that could be multimodal, they might be public, they might allow you to combine an analysis with an archive, and they might allow scholarship to move outside of the academy in interesting ways. And from the experience of Vectors and using the software we built for the back end of Vectors, our team built Scalar, which is an authoring platform, kind of like a WordPress, but that can behave quite differently, that allows you to build robust multimedia scholarly projects. And many people have been involved in the conception and development and ongoing use of Scalar. We've worked with archives, we've worked with university presses, we've worked with libraries at many institutions, and we've worked with hundreds of scholars. And at any given time, Scalar has, perhaps 30,000, 40,000 users, and it's used in a variety of projects that I'll tell you a little bit about now. These are some of the people in our original teams. I want, to underscore that all of these projects are very deeply collaborative and iterative, shaping and changing over time. So the Third World Majority Archive is a Scalar project that includes the archive, all the materials, the video, the digital storytelling videos, the documents of the production, the minutes of the Society of an activist organization called Third World Majority from the early 2000s. And that group, in a very early moment of digital storytelling, worked with youth of color to produce their own stories. And this project brings that archive together, but it also creates a series of what I would say are slices through the archive, right? So when you open it up, you have both the archival materials, and you could just go look at all of those and poke around, or you could read a series of essays or interviews that are written about the archive and that bring materials from the archive into the essays themselves. This is a project done at the University of Pennsylvania as a collaborative freshman seminar project that was attempting to get students interested in archival special collections at the library. So a small freshman seminar of students spent the entire semester studying a ship, the Clarence, and a journey it made in 1864 and 1865. And as a demonstration of what they did that semester, the students collaboratively built the Scalar project. It includes a timeline, different maps, the archival documents, and a series of many research projects the students did in relation to the materials. Black Quotidian is a daily project published by Matt Delmont, a scholar at Dartmouth. And it's a public knowledge project that each day drops an interesting daily anecdote, fact, historical document about Black life in America, and they collect, right? It also has won a Garfinkel Prize from the American Studies Association. This project, Transcribing Faith, is a use of Scalar by the Newberry Library in Chicago. And the Newberry has taken many of their documents related to different histories of faith that they don't have transcriptions of. They're physical documents, they have them scanned, but they don't have transcribed interface of what the documents say. So they built a widget for Scalar, because Scalar is open source on GitHub, worked with us, and loaded all of that material online so that fans of the Newberry Library, the public, could come in and transcribe the documents. They did a similar project around Shakespeare and another project around postcards, and had really good uptake of the public with the materials. Digital Paxton is another combo hybrid project that is exploring a historical massacre of indigenous peoples in the Northeast by bringing together many different collections of documents. So these are all archives that hold some material in relation to this historical event, but the material is scattered, right? And what the Scalar interface does is allow you to look at all of those different archives and their material in one collected interface. But the project also provides maps, analytical essays, teaching aids, a variety of materials to help someone understand this historical event, teach about the event, and move through a lot of different information about the event. Constructing the Sacred is a fairly recent scholarly book. It exists in this digital form and not as a print book, largely because a large part of the book's argument revolves around digital models of reconstruction of Egypt that Elaine has built, right? So these models are part of the book, and they help make the argument of the book. So you're able to enter the historical models and see from different points of view how these historical structures might have been inhabited and navigated, what lines of sight in them are available. And it's a really great example of what happens when you could hold your evidence together with your analysis. And in this case, the evidence is 3D models. And this is another of the kind of award-winning projects that have been produced. We work with a variety of institutions. University of Illinois Library publishes projects that are developed in Scalar. Brown University similarly does that work. They use many different platforms. And Stanford Press as well is publishing books in Scalar. Different institutions teach with Scalar. Harvard has used it fairly extensively in its digital teaching labs, as have other universities. And we participate as grant partners with scholars from around the country and indeed outside of the country. This is a project by scholars from North Carolina who were interested in different ways to explore how mapping might work and how we might think about mapping and time together, right? And so Eric Lawyer, who's been our creative director from the Vector days, worked with David and Kate to develop a feature they imagined for Scalar called lenses. And those lenses allow a different way of interacting with space-time. And we choose the partnerships for those kinds of grants when they will help us do something like build a new feature for Scalar as part of that work. And then we also work with folks who want to extend Scalar for their own uses. And one good example of that is Ravenspace, which is itself a digital publishing platform built on top of kind of the guts of Scalar, right? It's done through the University of British Columbia Press. It's beginning to kind of publish in Ravenspace projects like this, as I remember it, which not unlike in some ways Kim Kristen's Vectors project on Indigenous knowledges, works with communities to present Indigenous knowledge in respectful and rich forms that the community themselves participate in, so that the design and the distribution of the projects depends on Indigenous approval and contribution in how the projects are conceptualized and designed. This is a project that is actually from one of the grad students in the PhD program I mentioned earlier, Media Arts and Practice. And it's done in Scalar with the Open API as a kind of digital choose your own adventure game that is in a kind of speculative fiction or sci-fi register about someone trapped at a border trying to cross and trying to make decisions as a person of color about how best to interact with the border. It was part of Misha Cardenas's dissertation when she was a grad student, and she has recently published a really fantastic new book on trans poetics that just won the Gloria Anzaldúa Award, and I would highly recommend it. Another project, one of the last I'll kind of feature out of Scalar, is an early one that Eric Lawyer worked with the educator and activist Evan Bissell on. It's a good example of Scalar's API, which basically is the programming layer that lets you build a thing that could run in browsers or on phones. And this project explores hundreds of years of the tension between freedom and imprisonment at a variety of different registers. And when it's interactive, you would swipe across this interface and pry open the images that you see and learn more about the moment that they represent. And then you could also click through this experimental interface to a workbook, really, that helps you kind of understand those materials and that has a kind of rich capacity to be used in after school education and in different kind of programming needs. Now, Scalar was born out of the frustration we felt our scholars had with database software and the traditional tools you would work with databases. And we tried to build into its design not only lessons in how technology could behave differently at the code level, but how you might think about the relation of parts in a project differently, very much influenced by feminist and other practices. So I don't think we could have built Scalar in the way that we did if we hadn't done the more experimental work that we did with vectors over time. And both projects have really allowed us to think about how in both theory and practice, human and machine are constantly reshaping each other, and that it's vitally important that humanists and artists be involved in the construction of new technological systems. And we work on that a lot at the Amundsen Lab, which is directed by my colleague Curtis Fletcher, who will be running a workshop for some of you tomorrow. And Curtis at the lab, which is part of the Harman Academy for Polymathic Study, which I direct, really tries to situate technology in a digital lab in context, right? So it's very important that we not just teach a student how to use a 3D printer or teach them how to use an analytical text tool, right? But instead, we want them to think about how technologies make meaning in culture, how technologies shape how we interact with each other, how technologies rejigger our sense of place and time, right? And so we think about our role as teaching technology in context, and that's what we want undergraduate and graduate students to take away from their time in the lab, particularly the students we work with as our innovation scholars who work deeply on faculty projects. We really want them to have time to think about how you might imagine a technology differently, or even, I think more importantly, for say our engineering students, should you build that technology at all? just because you can build a technology doesn't necessarily mean the technology will serve the greater good. So we want students to really engage technology through a set of long-standing humanistic and ethical questions, and really come to their own technological design in new ways, right? We also have some larger lessons we've learned, if there are those of you out there in digital labs or in digital spaces, right? We've really tried to think about the tension between being experimental and trying unthought of things, and what it means to build a thing that could be sustained and scaled. I don't think either of those two things is necessarily the right path, but to know that those things are often in tension and that you need to navigate them is important. And I think if you're going to do digital work, and those of you who've programmed and do code probably know, you're also going to have to deal with failure. It's a form that has a lot of unexpected, bugs, no pun intended, and progress is not always going to be direct or linear, but there's great benefit, I think, to learning to work with these platforms. So I think I'll wind to a close here, but what I do want to suggest to you that it's probably wasn't an accident that those feminist filmmakers in the 70s and 80s started to do that work with such intensity at that historical moment. Because the 70s and 80s were a time of great technological change, even though we don't always think of it that way, right? The 70s and 80s were really a period in which portable video cameras became widely available and people were able to make media without super expensive equipment. But also things like public access television and cable programming changed media networks. And so feminists came together to intervene in those spaces, recognizing that we were in a moment of great technological shift, right? And we're in that moment again. And so I think it's very important that we continue not only to hold theory and practice together, but that we forcefully insert humanistic and ethical questions into the design of technologies. And I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer some questions. I will tell you, I probably can't read my screen the way it's set up right now. So it would be great, Brian, if someone could tell me the questions, if there's some there.
Thank you. Thanks, Tara. So many interesting projects and bits of great experience that you've shared. And yeah, I can read the questions to you. We've got a couple coming in. And just a reminder, folks, to put your questions, if you have questions for Tara, put them in the Q&A box and we'll kind of go through them as they come in. The first question I have is from Ben Allen, and he says, the idea of a bot using a language model is super interesting. Have you thought about using one of the newer models like ChatGPT to automatically spread information on Twitter?
There are several folks doing ongoing projects around bots in the MAP program, the Media Arts and Practice program. And Sarah, whose project that was, continues to kind of refine and work in that space. Our approach to programs like ChatGPT in the lab right now is cautious movement, right? So I don't inherently think that there's no place for ChatGPT in universities, right? I think it's a platform that, like any other platform, we need to provide students ways to analyze what it does, to think about what it gets right and wrong, and figure out how it could be used with kind of both ethics and care, right? So we just had at the lab this week, we have Curtis and Matt's run a series of student conversations, and this week's student conversation about ChatGPT had about 70 students show up to talk about it, think it through. I know at the administration and professor level, many people are busy rethinking their assignments to make them Chat GPT proof, to think about what you ask a student to do and how they would document their writing in order to, maybe prevent things just being written in Chat GPT. In my experiments with it so far, I think it would have a hard time writing essays for the classes I teach. But it's not to say it won't learn, I find its mistakes super fascinating, and the confidence with which it reports that wrong information is also very entertaining.
Yes, thank you. I have a question. This one is from Dave. This is via the back channel here. He sent me a couple questions. You see, well, one is, what does Scalar have any form of peer review?
Well, Scalar itself is sort of a platform, right? So as a platform, it does not have peer review, but it has peer review in its use, right? So like the project published by Elaine Sullivan at Stanford Press went through all the levels of peer review that publishing a monograph with Stanford would go through, right? And then it had some additional levels because you have to review them both at the level of content, with expertise in her field, to make sure what she's saying is, correct in an academic sense. But then you also need to review it in terms of interface and functionality and design to make sure it's usable and user-friendly in different ways. So the level of peer review, I'd say, is on a continuum from none to a whole lot, depending on what the audience or the publisher for the project might be, right? So I believe peer review is even more important for many kinds of scholarly output in digital work. But if someone is doing a class project in Scalar, the peer review is probably their professor and not a lot beyond that, right? And someone could use Scalar to do a project that goes out into the wild that we don't even know about, much like you would use WordPress. And we have user terms of agreement. So if something egregious is in that project and it is flagged, we could take it down. But, those kind of projects don't effectively undergo peer review.
Thank you. Question from Shauna Shipley Gates. For these Scalar projects, how many are built for a community-based audience?
That too is very variable, right? So out of the tiny selection of projects I showed you, I would say that was a vectors project. Public Secrets was for a community. The 2 projects about Indigenous knowledge were meant to be for publics more than academics, right? To really help audience, in the first case, to help audiences understand the different access to ideas or property that Aboriginal peoples had relative to Silicon Valley, right, or Western property law. And then the second project more to promote cultural heritage in a way that was respectful to Indigenous storytelling. So those, are definitely public oriented. Matt Delmont's Black Quotidian is meant for a public, not for academics, which I think is one of the interesting things about designing a platform rather than a project, right? Because the platform could have many different lives and many different audiences. Elaine Sullivan's book is an academic book, right? But other projects in Scalar, like Eric Lawyer and Evan Bizzle's The Knotted Line, is meant for the public. Eric also did a project for the Stanford Martin Luther King Center, which is a beautiful animated audio experience of the I Have a Dream speech that you hear the speech, but what's scrolling across your iPad or browser is the transcript that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. read from. And as you're listening, you're seeing his improvisation from the script he had written himself. And those changes become highlighted in the interface as you hear them. And then certain words start to accumulate into like falling clouds of words that you could explore that give you much more history and context for King's activism that really pushes beyond the kind of sanitized image of King that is often, kind of held up in schools. And that was very much a public facing project meant to bring different people into a new understanding of King's history.
Great, thank you. Next question. Community collaboration is an effective way to share stories of cultures, but how has Scalar provided technological training for communities to be mutually beneficial?
That's a great question. We for many years, and since COVID, they've been on abeyance because our staff really refocused to campus issues as we converted to Zoom teaching. California had 1.5 years of Zoom teaching. So we put on hold the Scalar workshops that we held, but those were open to anybody to kind of come in and learn to use the platform. And then we did a number of community-based trainings working with, in LA in particular, community archives. So archives that are usually fostered by nonprofits or community groups, teaching them different ways to think about using digital archiving in the platform to tell stories. We've worked with K-12 groups. We had a decently long-standing but slightly frustrating kind of project with LA Public Schools, right? So there are a variety of different ways that the platform gets rolled out into spaces that aren't academic. One of the things that we're very interested in right now, and we have some grant applications underway that Curtis is leading, are ways that we continue to kind of train trainers. So we would like to partner with, in the writing of the grant and then its execution, with lesser served institutions, less financially stable institutions in the California system, community colleges, Cal States, right? So that we provide both the server space and the training for their librarians and technologists to then use Scalar as they best see fit within their own communities. So it's kind of a variable approach. And then the other thing about Scalar that delights me, but is not because of us, right, is that it's out there in the world. So people use it and we may not know about it. I've several times been in an event where somebody has come up to me and said, hey, have you heard about this platform Scalar? And I take that as a sign of the success of its diffusion, that it could exist in places that we don't control or need to control.
Interesting. That actually relates to my next question, I think. So what has surprised you about the way that people have used Scalar? Maybe that you anticipate.
The original terms of the grant that funded Scalar initially, the first grants we had were from Mellon and then from NEH. And those grants were to fund digital scholarship. So many of the features of the platform were kind of conceived for scholars that might be writing with visual evidence, right? So they might be using photographs or video or film clips, and how to think about holding those kinds of multimedia together, right? And with some support for things like annotations and footnotes, right? I think it's been most expansively used in teaching and in museums and libraries, which are not, the first context in which we developed it. But then the negative side of what has most surprised me is when you hit a certain level of success, you also have to deal with a lot of headaches, a lot of problems. Folks who because the platform was open source and openly available, people could sign up for an account, and we didn't excessively vet them because we believed in openness. And people began creating Scalar books because there are thousands on our server, right? More, maybe tens of thousands that were only created to create link farms that would link to like gambling or other things, not because that was happening in the Scalar project, but as we've learned, if you have a link in your site to a accredited space like USC, it improves your algorithmic game, right? So, somebody somewhere discovered they could build a Scalar project, link it to their online gambling site in Bangladesh, and that would, help them get better Google ratings, right? So, and you could understand, you probably can anticipate my university did not want anything on our servers linked to gambling sites or, porn, right? So the kind of headaches that come with managing a platform, we grow weary of, right? But, it's, I guess, the cost of having a platform be relatively open.
Right. Next question, I guess, has to do with sustainability and preservation of these projects. You mentioned that, many of the vectors projects were built in Flash and are no longer available, or maybe they're available through the next project or elsewhere. But also, Scalar, well, it's open source and people can install it themselves. I think most Scalar books are probably hosted by USC, which makes it a lot easier to adapt and use. But what if USC administrators change their mind? And should we be concerned that Scalar books may be lost because of that? Or what kind of approaches are you taking to those questions?
We are still a very small team, right? My husband, who for many years was a technologist in the industry in LA at DreamWorks, said, you got to be careful not to have the bus problem, where if Craig gets hit by a bus, nobody knows what's going on with your code, right? And so we tried, from lessons learned with vectors, to build Scalar in ways that even if Scalar doesn't survive, and it won't survive forever, like no platform survives forever, MySpace, beta video, like things have their time, right? Things can be taken out of Scalar in different formats pretty easily, right? So one of the kinds of safeguards we built in is that you could export your Scalar project into different formats that could be reconstructed relatively easily in other things, right? You can't really export stuff to PDF because it's interactive and it's nonlinear, but you can export to data formats that at least allow you to keep things, right? Making them less losable, right? But that's not to say there's not a possibility that, we're in the cloud, like Scalar projects at USC now live on Azure, right? I have, problems with that too, but, you try to find your best solution. We used to have our own physical hard servers, but they're hard to maintain, and they have their own liabilities. They have relatively short lifespans, right? So I wouldn't want to lie to anybody and say, we totally have your back. Anything you build will last forever, right? Because it won't, right? That's just a reality of the digital. But we've tried to build Scalar as best we could, that Scalar ending would not mean everything disappears.
Thank you so much. We are at time. So I hope everyone will give Tara a big virtual applause. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us.